Welcome to Sacred Conversations, a place where Dr. Nicole Dolan and I, Robin Bethel, along with a myriad of guests, explore some of the sacred threads and wholeness of life, held within the light and within the dark, held within the immensity. Thank you for being with us. In this episode, Nicole and I speak with Josh Booton, a poet, musician, and speech-language pathologist. We talk of his poetry, which I adore, and his music with the band Mercy Giant, also beautiful. And in the process, we open into a wider discussion of art, connection, and the sacred, especially when it's illuminated and felt within a landscape of seeming contrast. On a technical note, when we recorded this, we had some internet connection issues that we did our best to navigate, but some of the final audio quality was affected. And still, this is one of my favorite conversations. Nicole and I hope you can feel any goodness here meant to meet you within all the imperfection. Hi, Nicole.
Good morning. Nice to see you guys.
And welcome, Josh.
Hey, great to be here.
Today we have with us Josh Booton, who is a poet, a musician, and a speech language pathologist. And he's someone that I came across first as a poet, then as a musician, and I don't know a lot of the rest of his story, but just based on his poetry, I wanted to have him join us, and today he is. So, Josh, would you like to introduce yourself however feels right to you?
Sure. Yeah. I guess I tell you a little bit about myself. I was born in Portland. I've lived in Boise for about 10 years. Like you said, I work as a speech language. Oh, that was perfect. I can't say speech language pathologist. I will say speech therapist. I work as a speech therapist with kids here in the Valley. And I have a wife and 2 kids. I also have a dog and a bunny named Otis, who's looking at me right now. And my passions, like you said, are poetry. I studied poetry at the University of Texas and was lucky enough to publish a couple books. And then a few years ago, transitioned to writing songs and started a band here called Mercy Giant. And so I'm always kind of looking for an artistic outlet. And that's sort of who I am.
Thank you. We also now return back to that question and ask you to introduce yourself, share some of who you are on a bit more of a soul level, whatever that would mean to you.
Yeah, it's interesting. I thought the timing of this conversation is great because we had talked about it quite a while ago. It just wasn't a great time. And I've been thinking about these questions a lot more outside of this in my life recently. And so I would say I'm a person who's a sensitive person, which is taking me a while to come around to. I shouldn't have been surprised considering poetry is pretty sensitive for the most part. I'm presuming it's very empathetic. And I've come to kind of realize that most of the major themes that I deal with have to do with connection and compassion and communication, because those are kind of the core tenets of who I think I am and what my goal is as a human being is to become more compassionate, more connected, and kind of help people around me. I'm a bit of a caretaker, and I try to reflect some of that through my art as well.
Thank you. The other question that I noted we would ask is, would you please share a story from your life that feels like a sacred story to you?
Yeah, this was really hard. I actually did the 3rd grade book report, go back and see what Merriam-Webster said about what the sacred was as defined. And I noticed there was a lot of religion embedded in the idea of the sacred, which for me isn't super comfortable. I'm not a very religious person. I'm essentially not really connected to Western religion. So I started to kind of think, what is sacred to me? And obviously my experience of art is sacred, but trying to think of a sacred story was difficult. And then I was listening to music, and I had a memory of listening to music. And I remember this story that I think is kind of an example of how I define the sacred. I was 19 years old. I had just finished my first year of college and actually was transferring schools because it wasn't a good fit. And I took a term off. And instead of doing something wonderful like traveling Europe, I got a job working for the city, cleaning city parks. So my job was to drive around in a truck and collect garbage. And this one day I was collecting garbage outside of a public pool. There was no one there. I was in the parking lot and it was pretty much empty. And I had one of those little extendable grabbers and I was walking around picking up cigarette butts in a parking lot, which doesn't sound like the setting for a sacred experience. But I was listening to the song Hallelujah, the version by Jeff Buckley. And I had just kind of found Jeff Buckley. And I think it might have been the very first time I heard the song. And I was listening and I remember there's this part near the end where there's this long instrumental and it feels like an outro. Just the song's wrapping up and you can tell where it's going to land. And I remember kind of saying in my head, I wish there was more to this. Like I didn't want it to stop because I was so wrapped up in that experience. And there was 3 seconds of silence and then that song starts again. And it just felt like, even though I was in this situation where I was picking up cigarettes outside this dirty public pool, there was something transcendent about it. It just kind of transformed everything around me. I remember I actually started crying just standing there in the middle of the park, which was such a strange experience. But I'll just keep one because I still remember it to this day. And I think for me, something that's really crucial is that the sacred only exists in contrast to the mundane and the dark and the dirty. It's always the relationship between those two things that kind of makes the sacred for me happen. If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that story. Thank you for sharing that.
You're
I
welcome.
feel like, to your point, the sacred and the mundane, and also the sacred in the mundane, the sacred in the mess. I feel like that story is so helpful in many ways for so many because often I think that we do feel and think of the sacred as something outside of us or something we need to go search for, or people who do align with certain religions believe that they're going to find it in a church or in someone else. And I love that story for a lot of reasons too. I actually had a lot of imagery coming through as you were sharing because I had this dream last night that I'll just share a little brief bits of, but there was this beautiful seal and this beautiful clear water with these rocks at the bottom. And I was carrying a piece of trash and the seal wanted me to throw it. And so I won't get into it further, but those imagery, like they were coming through as you were speaking because it was like, yeah, there's this sacred and also this garbage and this part of life. Like we live in the art of both, so I appreciate you sharing that story and even that moment of healing. I feel like that's a moment too when we know that we're resonating with something or something's happening is when we have emotion move through us without really any knowing that that was going to
For sure.
Um, we don't need to hold the sacred how you hold it by any means, but I feel like the story you shared completely resonates with how we hold the sacred as well, and I love that there's so much humming that you can't see, but it can be in a scene that's completely ordinary looking. And I love that you had this with Jeff Buckley too. I didn't discover Jeff Buckley until I was about 36, which, gosh, I don't know, maybe like 6 years ago. But when I did, he entered so large and I started listening to Grace. And I don't think I've ever felt that swift and deep of a connection to the artist on the other side of a track just based on what I was hearing from their voice. And I kind of been infatuated with him a little. And one of the characters in my novel is an imagined fusion of a person and the ghost of Jeff Buckley. So
Oh, I love that. I didn't know that.
there's something really
Yeah.
special about Jeff Buckley. So what better person to bring you such a story?
Yeah.
I want to share too. I mean, first off, that's one of my favorite songs. So I love that too. I feel like we're all kind of resonating there. But I want to share too something that was coming through really quick is what you're sharing. I feel like also really speaks to and might resonate with a lot of people as when you do start really listening, when you do start really opening to something. And I wonder if that's true for you, if that was a new experience for you.
Interesting. Um, Actually, no, but my life has taken kind of a strange curve with the sacred and the spiritual. I was as a child and a teenager very attuned. I just had this understanding, this idea that the distance between where I was in this world and something else beyond that world, like that wall was very thin. I used to spend tons of time just on the weekends hiking through the forest, just kind of thinking and feeling. It was very easy for me. And then as I got older and got a career and a family and had all these things to do, I noticed that that kind of got pushed down. And I think art took over as that kind of connection. That was my conduit because I was writing more and now writing songs. And so that was my connection. But that day to day basic level, that kind of what you sort of brought up is that stillness that's required for the sacred, whether you supply the stillness or something outside of you shocks you into stillness. I wasn't very good at that for a long time outside of when I was creating, partly because the creative mind is oftentimes not the still mind for me. I'm constantly thinking and trying to grab things from here and there. And so I tend to be a little scattered. But I would say in the last few years, I've kind of had a return to that because I was feeling that there was something that I had known before that I had forgotten.
Mm.
With that song and that moment, those 3 seconds of silence before that song picks back up, that's that little interval where suddenly we are acutely aware of ourselves and our body, but we're also acutely aware of something that's beyond us, and somehow that those spaces sort of kind of overlap suddenly, and we have this experience.
When was it that you wrote poetry most? Because I think as you framed it, you're more in songwriting now. So, what was kind of that flurry of poetry for you?
I was like trying to learn how to write poems from copying Elliott Smith's songs when I was in high school. It was pretty early.
Hmm.
All my early poems had drug references, and just because Elliott Smith was my songwriter, so I was kind of copying that a little bit. And then I was at Texas in my late 20s, so I was really basically got to spend 3 years just being a writer. And then in my mid 30s, so like maybe a little late 30s, so maybe 5, 6 years ago, I got tired of making art by myself. I wanted connection. And so that's when I started writing songs,
Mm.
got a band together because it's a very different experience. And you don't have as much control, which at that time is that felt good. I wanted collaboration.
So, about 5 or 6 years ago, you started Mercy Giant or another band?
I started at that time kind of learning how to write songs because melody is a
Right.
different kind of meter than you would have in poetry. Probably 6 years ago, I started just sitting down trying to figure out how to write a song. And just like poetry, I just wrote lots of bad songs. Just got them out until I found something that I liked. And then after a couple of years of doing that, I ended up reaching out to some friends, and then we started Marcy Giant.
And then now, since you've been in that space and you're writing songs, have you set poetry down for now and you're kind of alive, like fully in this other space creatively?
Yeah, I have. I haven't really written a poem in the last 4 or 5 years, although I've started to feel the pull a little bit. And I've also started to feel the pull to write music by myself. So I've got Mercy Giant and I love collaborating, but I've started to do some home recording with solo music also, just because there's parts that can't always be expressed in an indie rock band. There's certain things that are hard to touch upon, but I think I know at some point I will go back to poetry.
I'm glad, but I also respect your creative arc wherever it takes you. Can I ask you to read a poem?
Sure.
So, Josh has two collections of poetry: The Union of Geometry and Ash, which is where I fell in love with him as poet, and then also The Miraculous Courageous, which is really, really different and written in the voice of an autistic teenager. Is that right?
Yes.
What I would love for you to read is, do you have both of those with you, by the way?
I have, I do. I have the Union of Geometry and Ash right here. It's harder to share from the Miraculous Courageous, so intertwined. But I did mark a couple of poems in Union of Geometry and Ash.
What would you like to read?
Well, it's funny. I haven't looked at this in probably like 4 years. It's really interesting to go back after that long and kind of go through it, especially with the lens of the sacred, because you don't always reflect on kind of what your themes and angles are. You just are obsessed with something and you write over a period of time and they come out. So it was interesting trying to look at that. And it's funny because I think I actually flagged the first poem in the book and the last poem. So like book, yeah. So I think I'll read. So I'm going to read this poem called "A Piece of Paper on the Interstate." this is a poem that's a kind of about this moment of creative empathy, which oftentimes creative empathy is kind of a gateway to the sacred for me because it's kind of fostering connection, even if that connection is somewhat imagined. So I'll do my best here. A piece of paper on the interstate. Something wounded in the way, it flutters and dives, revealing the wake of 18-wheelers with one wide arc that reminds me of a deaf girl's hands. The sign for evening, which is almost here, the traffic slowing, so we can taper ourselves into the tunnel that leads toward night. Or the way the paper turns now, alternating front to back, the sign for tree as leaves in the wind, a single sheet dreaming itself back into the forest. It's probably nothing but a grocery list, a phone number no longer needed, though I hope a little it's a love letter addressed to the inmate crew who will clean the roadside later this week. An SOS from the young widow 7 cars ahead. I'd go to her now, wade with her through this momentary ocean of cars, carry her as we both are carried toward whatever shore will take us, the tiny island of her bed, where I tuck her snugly beneath a paper white sheet. Or maybe we just hold each other, practicing the mild origami that intimacy is, overlapping ourselves until her despair means my keys on the side table, my longing the arches of her feet, until her soft sobs turn to car horns and traffic picks up again, and I remember she doesn't exist. Only this piece of paper that touches a moment the ground and is gone.
Thank you.
Wow. I have not heard that before, and I love that genuinely. Yeah.
It's interesting again because this poem happened because of sitting in traffic. Very mundane and sometimes even slightly bothersome.
hmm Well, and you can even feel that in the arc of the poem. You can, with the imagery that comes to mind as you're listening, it takes you on that arc, right? So from being in traffic to back to being in traffic with the paper. But I mean, the places that it takes you in between is just, it's stunning. Yeah.
Thanks.
I really love the line about her despair, and now this isn't the exact phrasing, but becoming your keys on the end table. So lovely. That was one of the ones I had dog-eared for sure. And it's interesting too. We again have this note of the trash.
Yeah, I also intertwined with me. I really think as I looked back over these poems, I was surprised by how much it's always the contrast of these elements that are dirty or broken, people that are damaged, and yet transcendence through connection. I think this whole book was just this kind of trying to connect with other people through art and words. And I think something that sort of was hinted at earlier, in beautiful music like Jeff Buckley and why he's so effective. I think there's this element of vulnerability that's really important to the sacred too, because we're talking about kind of this breaking down of barriers. And that I think is something I'm kind of obsessed with, is trying to be vulnerable, even though that's very uncomfortable.
Mm. Yeah. I was going to say, something's just really coming through as you're sharing. Like I can feel that arc, not only in your art, but in your life. Like it's feeling very special to you. I don't know exactly how to say that, how to articulate it, but as you're sharing it, it feels like it's like, oh, this is life for you. And it's quite beautiful. And the other thing that's kind of interesting, Robin, is that it reminds me, I don't know, I'm not going to go so far as to say you as a writer, because I haven't gotten to read you as a writer specifically, besides your beautiful poetry, but you as editor too. Like it reminds me of how you transform story, like both of you are speaking about how you transform story from one place of, this is how we experience it in this like 3D dense reality form, to really bringing nuance into, I don't want to say like romanticizing, because there's also such deep truth, maybe even just saying sacred. You can feel how it becomes art.
Did you ever like William Blake?
For sure. Definitely. Very mystical poet.
Yes, and just very like the marriage of innocence and experience, right? Like the union of all the things, holding all the things together. And then the title of the book, is The Union of Geometry and Ash. And I think that what struck me immediately first was just the title. I don't know if a title has ever struck me so much because I think there's such a fullness in that, not just because we're uniting like this and that, but each piece, each word, geometry and ash, they have different shapes to them too. It's not even just like two things that contrast. It's like two things that are such different invisible shapes, like geometry and then ash. And so, like, holding those together has such a roundness to it. Well, I don't mean, I was talking about shape, so I don't know if roundness is the right word, but such a fullness, such a all the thingsness, which I think we've been talking about here often, like feeling these experiences while you're collecting trash and being in traffic, watching a piece of trash flutter, and then having this imagining that takes you somewhere and brings that piece of you that connects alive. So,
That title came from a failed poem, actually, which was interesting. And what you were saying, something I liked about that is being a speech therapist in my other life, I work a lot on articulation, motor speech disorders, how people make their sounds. So I think constantly about the mouth, which is a weird space to be in. But what I liked and caught me with that line was even the way we say them and the way they feel in your mouth, the vowels, the consonants. Geometry is such a hard, angular word, and ash is just this kind of very soft. Whoever created those particular terms did a really good job because they express in the sounds of those words, they have an expression meaning, it seems like. Creating words, I would love that job.
you'd really need someone with the right authority. I think you have the right authority for it. It's funny, I think of you so much as poet and musician primarily, first and foremost, but you've been a speech language pathologist for a long time, right? Do you want to speak a little bit about that word?
Yeah, I've been a speech path for, oh my goodness, a little over 20, no, 20 years because I had a little break in there while I was writing it. I did work. And before that, actually, through high school, one of my jobs was I was a counselor at a camp for kids with special needs. Human connection, that's always, there's no wonder that would be a theme because it was always in my life from a pretty early age. And I think one thing, especially when you're trying to create art, to have some human experience, I think is really valuable. And I think that my experience as a speech therapist is one of the things that's kind of informed my themes and how I write and that urge to kind of connect with people and communicate.
Yeah. I'd love to hear about how this other book did come about. How did that happen?
It's such a strange project. I'm trying to remember. Throughout my career, I've kind of specialized in different areas. And at that time, I was working primarily with kids with ASD. And so it's definitely a huge part of my world. And then it happened in this way that's so strange that I think the best things always start this way. I became obsessed with seahorses briefly, and I have no idea why. You just like learn about something and you're like, it's really interesting. And somehow I conflated this character of this teenage boy and the way that his obsession would be seahorses and sea life. And so it became this kind of world I could explore and try to create a kind of way for him to speak through monologues to slowly kind of reveal the layers of him and his life and his mind. But so often through these kind of expressions and obsessions with sea life, specifically seahorses, which are creatures that are kind of controlled by the sea. They don't have a ton of volition besides hanging on to things. It seemed like an apt metaphor for someone who is neurodivergent and had all these world forces kind of pushing on them. And they're trying to adapt to this set of rules and agreements that they never really had any say in. And the world's not so willing always to adapt to the way that they experience things. And so that became really interesting to me. And again, to try to inhabit someone else's consciousness for a little bit is always the thing that I'm most interested in.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. I just want to sit with that. for a little bit. When you were first sharing about it before we started recording, I imagined that it was this, autistic child that wrote it with you or, you got from him. But I hear that it's an experience of working with these kids that, like you said, you inhabited that consciousness and allowed it to really move through you. And that's beautiful.
Yeah, it was a fun experience, and also I wrote it pretty quickly. I mean, my first book took 3 years, I think, and I think I wrote that book really in a period of like 6 months because I was able to kind of just envelop myself in that character. I kind of required that because it takes that kind of imaginative leap, something you kind of have to immerse yourself in and can't really dabble in it. So it was kind of more of an intense experience of writing that book. I think, though, in the future, if I write poems, and I think I will, I probably will return more to the style of my first book.
So, right now, when you write songs for Mercy Giant, do you still obviously you create them in community, like the songs fully emerge in that, but when you write them, do you shift how you write? Are you still kind of writing from your singular self, or are you trying to like envelop the group consciousness a little bit more?
Interesting. It's a good question. Some writers are and songwriters are very autobiographical, and I am not very autobiographical at all. I still tend
Mm,
to explore scenarios and characters, and oftentimes the I in the song is a character, trying to kind of transmute my consciousness into someone else's experience and speak about that the best I can. I would just like that. So, in a way, I don't have to negotiate that as much with the other band members because the speaker is rarely me talking about my life.
mm, I see. Are you working on melody as you write the songs too, like kind of a bass line and then it fleshes out from there? Or how does that work?
That's really interesting. That's what took me forever to figure out. Those first couple of years, lots of bad songs were because I would write lyrics because that's what I knew how to do is write words. And then I would kind of try to
Mhm.
shoehorn some kind of progression and then try to find a vocal melody that, and it always kind of felt a little clunky. So now I always start by messing around on the guitar usually, sometimes the piano, and just finding a progression and then kind of pulling a little bit of a melody out from that. And then usually kind of this mumble track, where I'm just saying nonsense or vowels or something as I'm going along just to find that vocal melody and then fitting the words to that vocal melody, which not only works better, but honestly, it's great because the stricture of that form forces my brain to come up with lyrics that would be vastly different if I just sat down and tried to write a song and then thought about the music afterwards. It's kind of like Robert Frost, that idea of poetry without meter is like playing tennis without a net, which obviously we have tons of great reverse poetry, so it's not exactly true. But sometimes having that stricture, something to push against, you can't really think your way through it. You have to kind of surprise yourself. And that's always when you have the most exciting writing.
I'd love to hear you talk more about this sense of, you talked about like the sacred rising in stillness, and you talked about times where that stillness came from moments of creation, like your time creating was when you had most stillness. And then, yeah, then the drive to then create with others, um, which maybe doesn't have that same stillness, or does it?
Interesting. Um, yeah, I think that stillness for me, which is interesting because when I write poems, I tend to walk around the house. I don't like, sometimes I'll sit at a desk, but I really need to be moving, which opposite stillness. But sometimes I'll be writing lines and lines, not really finding the meat of whatever I want to say. And it comes to an impasse where I go, like, this isn't working. And I kind of stop. And those tend to be the moments where if I give myself a little time, something enters that's unexpected. And so I think stillness is kind of one way to describe it. I also think attention, it just requires attention to have that experience. In music, playing with people, that attention often comes from us trying to work out a song by just playing together, just kind of jamming, having a general idea, having a progression, playing 20 minutes, 30 minutes. And often what we'll notice is we struggle, there's some good stuff here. And then some point things kind of coalesce in a way where we go like, okay, this is working, this is where it is. And the stillness there is really just concentration of what you're doing and then paying attention to what everyone else is doing. So it's always this like stillness, attention, concentration. That seems to be that prerequisite to have the sacred, that kind of that experience that is new and exciting and a little bit outside yourself.
Hmm. I feel like you're really discussing the process of making art and creativity and how it happens. And, for any of us who have delved into our creativity, most of us, hopefully, but whether it's through writing poetry, making music, right? However it is that we engage, I feel like you're really speaking about that art of the creative process, which I think is really important for people sometimes to know is that it's not always easy, right? And that it is very much a part of the process to be in those jagged edges, those spaces of like, okay, what's going to fit here? What's going to come through? And then I think, I can speak for myself, but I imagine you experience this too. When it does come together, it's like that integration feels so good, so beautiful and amazing. You're like, okay, it clicks. It's here. And then you get to be the witness of your own art in that way.
Yeah, sometimes I feel like that moment, that integration you speak of, that's really the best part of art in general. It's
Yeah.
wonderful when people experience your
Yeah.
art and give you good feedback and you have this finished artifact to share with people. But the reason I do it, I think the people that have to create art, I think it's really that is what it is. It's that those moments where these things integrate and they click together. I've heard it described as almost like the artist is more of a conduit than a creator. Somehow these things coalesce
Hmm.
moment inside you and you couldn't do it in reverse. You couldn't pull it apart and explain how it happened. If you could, then it wouldn't have happened in the first place.
Exactly. And what else has really been coming through? So I appreciate that you bring up that idea of conduit versus creator. I read recently Elizabeth Gilbert's Big Magic, and she talks about that a lot. How basically, and she gives a really good example, which is just fascinating about how she wound up having the same idea that she once kind of let pass, not necessarily by choice, but then wound up in somebody outside of her. But basically, she's talking about how she spoke about ideas as like beings or like consciousness that come to us and inspire us and give us the opportunity to bring them into life. And then she went even further to say that, and when we don't, and there's no right or wrong to this, but when we don't bring that idea through us, that it travels on to someone else to be created, to be brought forth. And so I think that that's a fascinating idea. And I think any of us who have really created from heart and soul know what you're talking about when you say, yeah, there's something sacred that comes through.
It's a really interesting concept because I never, that conception almost creates this reality where artists are like a team, like a network, like we're all working with the same materials and some of us, we just pull different things, but that those materials all exist independently. And so we become kind of this almost like scribes or interpreters for this thing that exists for everyone, which is very interesting because I've always thought of it more as like the artist interpreting, like, would we both be given the same kind of this little object, this little being or energy enters both of us and then is transcribed in two different ways. And so it's our expression of the same thing. But I kind of like that idea of like, there's it's like a sky full of birds. And if you don't catch this one, then it goes to someone else. It's an interesting idea.
And it's definitely just one idea, but it was certainly something that I took from that book and said, huh, that is really fascinating.
I feel like where it might resonate a little more for me, touching into this idea of when you find that integration where the elements integrate, it's almost like you're reaching into this invisible ether, and like when the shape is suddenly right, when you touch it and all the things integrate, it's like the note, the chord, where everything meets in wild, precise imprecision or whatnot. There's something there that's just really real. So that's kind of how I would personally then hold Elizabeth Gilbert's sense, where there are all these things, and then we're each trying to like clutch at these pieces of just what is really real. I don't know.
Yeah, as a depth psychologist, I believe in the collective unconscious, right? So everything is interconnected, and so is there a field that we all kind of work together and gather from to create? Certainly, I can get on board with that. But we all bring our individual, unique soul imprint perspectives when we are the one that, grabs that bird or whatever analogy you use, Josh.
I would feel like it's always going to have been if someone lets that idea flutter by, and someone else, like it was always meant to not be theirs to birth.
Right. I agree. And I will say also, though, what's kind of fascinating in this book is she actually, the reason that she speaks about this and then uses it as an example is she gives an example of a book that she wrote with like specific character, plot line, story, everything. And it was, I believe it was a fiction story that she was creating. And even like the time that it was set and the place that it was, she gives this example of how she wrote this book. And then she went through a period of life that made it, not time to bring that book into the world herself. I think something happened to her computer and she lost the book. And then she met someone, another beautiful author, artist years later who wrote the same exact book. So it was food for thought, and it was just kind of
Yeah.
fascinating to hear.
I know that does kind of light a fire under a lot of writers, who I've heard talk about that book.
Like they
So,
better grab the idea.
yeah, yeah, it gives them urgency.
With that discussion, we kind of are like presupposing that the artist is formed in a way where the materials they take will create something that is reflective of them as an artist. I oftentimes feel that the creative process is actually a process of figuring out who you are. Those surprises and your reaction to those really starts to then shape who you become as an artist. And I think after that happens enough, then maybe you say, I'm drawn to this. I notice this tendency, or on a basic level, I'm good at this. And I'm interested in that process because it took forever as a poet to kind of figure out who you want to be as a voice. You try on a lot of hats and you imitate a lot of people. And then I went through that process the same again with songwriting. I'm still going through that process. So it's interesting how we're kind of shaping, but also being shaped by that selection, which selection might seem too strong. It seems like you create the space, you work at it continuously, you're there, you're ready to receive it. So it's more like these receptions, kind of we are shaping them and they are also shaping who we are as adults, if that makes sense.
And I think probably at all parts of that journey and process, we're releasing things and meant to, like I feel it's kind of the same as when we're talking about like the unintegrated experience, or if we're speaking from a place of we're already holding this and a lot of integration and coherence. And I feel like both are beautiful and meant to be. So then, like, in terms of our art, there's the times where you're reaching and finding that within yourself. And then there's the times too when it's like you do feel like you've found that, like your voice, and beyond that, what you were meant to share. I think there are so many beautiful artists where they're feeling into what they feel and what they think as they create. And then I would say for me, like I usually already have that down and like 99, like, I mean, I'm so intricately connected to my inner experience constantly in real time that like in most cases, the real time goes so fast that for me, I usually am coming from it in a different space where I'm more like I'm expressing something that I already am have kind of like arrived at inside, which maybe is not, I think, the more beautiful art way, but it's just how I'm meant to do it.
Well, I think a lot of people do create from that space because at least how I'm interpreting, how I'm hearing is that inspiration comes from having holding those shapes or having that experience or feeling something that wants to move and be expressed. And like you're saying, what that is or most of what that is. And I think that that's where a lot of art does start. And I think that, I mean, I don't know, I can't say this for everyone, so I'll just say it for myself. It was new for me to, as a writer, move into a place where I was open to creating from the mess. Like it felt like it was different. It was certainly not the place I wanted to be writing from. So I think it's just, I think it's different. And then the other thing that kind of just comes with that, and that's what I'm saying, like, I don't want to overgeneralize, but I'll say for myself, what I noticed as a psychologist too, like watching what people are going through in the collective and on the micro level too, is we are in the mess. We are in chaos. We are in a very in between state of life that is very uncomfortable in many ways. And so I do think a lot of art that's getting created right now is part of that collective mess, which is also sacred, which brings us to, your
Yeah.
work too, Josh. Yeah.
Yes. And I feel like the place of poem is always like a place for the mess because I just feel like, and I don't know why, but I feel like poem, like as life, poem as item on a page, it is the holder of all the things. Like for it to really feel like a poem to me, it feels like it holds all the things.
You sent me a message once, and I wish I could remember exactly what it was, but you said a poem to me is, you use some example of something really beautiful and sacred and the spilt milk on the floor. You said something like that to me, and I was like, that makes so much sense. Robin's been really working on getting me into poetry over time. And it was something that was most appealing to me. I was like, oh, I could get really into poetry like that, which is what you're sharing today, Josh. So I appreciate it because it is so beautiful to hold it that way, to hear that, like, this is a container for all of those things, that spectrum, of the sacred and the mess.
Yeah, and poetry in some ways has a disadvantage because it's all just words. There's nothing else there that you can add on top of it, and so it's kind of trying to figure out how to get all that into just speech, which for me, I've always loved the definition of poetry that Emily Dickinson gave. It said, like, when you read a poem, it feels like someone took the top of your head off. And that's what I always feel like. There's this kind of expansion, and you're almost shaken, but you feel really alive. I really like that definition. And I was going to say, I'm jealous that you can create art from this place of knowing kind of who you are and what you want to say and you execute it. Because I have drawers full of poems that don't sound like me and songs that don't sound like me because I'm constantly kind of taking on these personas and trying to put myself in different people's headspace. And sometimes, I mean, it just leads me down a road. And so then it becomes more of a selective process of like, this seems to fit together and cohere. But there's so much mess around that process because I I don't think I ever go into a poem or a song kind of knowing what I want to say. It always starts with an image or a phrase, maybe a setting or a character, but I never have any idea what it's going to be about, which is exciting to me and also means that oftentimes it just kind of leads to a dead end or off into a field and you're like, well, it just didn't work.
Well, first, I mean that it's perfect. Like the process has been so perfect for you, you know? And that dead end field led you to the most perfect title for a book of poetry I've ever seen. Right? You said it was a failed poem. So yeah, I feel like it's all just right. To me, it feels like the more artistically pure or literary way is to kind of have it emerging in the creation, you know? And I just can't help it. That's not how it is for me. I kind of feel like in the world, I'm meant to have, I don't know. I don't want to go down into that too far, but it's just not my flow. But I think this is also beautiful, the exact flow. And I feel like when you talk about it, you do sound a lot like kind of like spirit of novelist or spirit of fiction writer as poet. You said your songwriting isn't usually autobiographical. You're kind of selecting stories, and the I is another character. Is that the same with? I know the miraculous courageous was, but your other poetry, was it autobiographical at all, or kind of more that dropping into character?
Think that first book, The Union of Geometry and Ash, I think is more autobiographical, although it's kind of using scenes from my life to explore ideas. But it's definitely more kind of, and I think this often happens with poets' first books is like you're pulling from that life experience. Some people have really exciting lives, so they can just keep doing that. I don't have enough material to keep producing books, songs just about me. So I moved away from that a little more. But every time you write a song or a poem about someone else, it's always your interpretation. So there's always part of you, it's all your consciousness. There's always going to be part of you in there, no matter how much you try to inhabit that other person.
Right.
I do think, I mean, that book, the first book, is definitely, it's me 100%. As far as the way my mind works and the way language works inside my head. And most of the narratives, some of them are just narratives, which is interesting because when I was writing it, that's where the biggest critiques were. Because narrative poetry was really big in the 1990s, and then kind of there was a pushback against narrative poetry. So I was kind of behind the time with that writing. And so there was always critiques of trying to, someone said, don't think your thoughts all the way through. So they were a little too neat and then take out the narrative elements. And I think I was smart enough at the time to go like, well, I like this, so I'm just going to keep it how it is. And I've noticed that the people that connect to that, they connect for those exact elements. So it's really interesting to kind of to think about that. Looking back over this book, I did realize how much of me in it, and also how much of the fact that I grew up in Portland is in this book. There's something about the personality of the city seems to be kind of like sad and transcendent that I think really permeates it too. And I think that's just always, that's the one thing I kind of can hang on. The way that I experience the world and those emotions that come up to me and most often the things I'm most obsessed with, those are things that are well defined. So I may not know what I'm trying to say when I start to create something, but I always carry that with me into that process.
Hmm. Yeah, like pieces of you are breathing out. Well, it makes me so happy to hear that you heard this feedback and you were like, I'm doing this how I want to. Because for me, like with poetry especially, I feel like it should be expression of what's meant to spill out, rather than trying to meet any sort of fashion or what's deemed the thing for the moment.
It seems like poetry is kind of maybe the most academic art. And so there's people think about these things a lot, partly because it's such an insular little world. It's really interesting to read kind of poets in the academy, poets that are held up for, moving poetry forward. And then you read something that's much more popular in the culture, like slam poetry. They have totally different value systems. And I think one of the things that's difficult about more academic poetry is oftentimes it just doesn't connect with people nearly as much. It always feels like, even the way we're taught poetry, like a code system and you have to figure it out. And that was something that never really made sense to me. It was always about language that felt alive and emotions being expressed.
Yes, it does feel like if it is trying to meet this intellectual standard, for me, it's not the heart of poetry at all, which is just this fullness, like what it is to be human and hold all of these shapes, like hold the geometry and the ash and just it to just come as it wants to come rather than trying to sound smart or trying to press people, just to like bring forth what's authentic. And if where you're living and residing is in that space, bring it forth. And then if not, don't try and mold yourself to be somebody else because the journals will publish it more. Just like express how you want to. And I'll also add, one thing that told me once that if I wasn't closely connected to my feelings, I would be a better poet.
That seems
Mm.
a very American idea to me in our poetry. Because when you had said, we're going to talk about the sacred and bring some poems, I noticed that for me, so many of the books I turned to immediately were non-American poems. Other
Mm.
traditions of poetry tend to forefront emotion, and that is kind of they're the emotional cachet of the culture. That's what they're known for. That's what they're there for. Also, going back to Jeff Buckley, why Jeff Buckley was more popular in France when he was alive than he was in America, because certain cultures are just more tuned to this. That was an overstatement, maybe.
Interesting. You like Lucille Clifton at all?
I do like Lucille Clifton. I was trying to figure out what my voice would be as a poet, and she was someone that sidelined me for a long time because I read, I think, Blessing the Boats, and I was really taken by it.
It's my favorite.
Yeah, but I had no
Yes.
idea how to incorporate something like that into my own writing, and I do that a lot. Like I'll experience some form of art or go see someone live, and I can get swept away and try to integrate that. And sometimes it's just too far from who I am to really integrate it. But that was one of those books that sidelined me in a great way for a while.
And maybe just like a breath of that gets in there, as it's meant to. But what I was going to say about Lucille Clifton is so a space Nicole and I are in that, not to bring that in specifically too much, but just, I mean, very kind of connected to the invisible world and the universe and have a few decks of oracle cards or tarot cards and things. And I have an oracle deck of Lucille Clifton. There's a series called Divining Poets, and they take a few poets, and then what they do is they, like with Lucille Clifton at least, they just break up stanzas into separate cards, so each card has 2 or 3 lines from Lucille Clifton, and I just shuffle the cards and I kind of let cards fly out at me, as they will. And that's what I kind of receive. But, anyways, what's so interesting with this deck with Lucille Clifton, I don't know what it is about her, but they're just like 2 line stanzas, sometimes 3 line stanzas, completely divorced from her full poem. And I've probably let cards fly out at me like over 100 times with this deck from her. And every time it looks like it was created to be a poem like that. Kismet jumbled, they always come into something that feels like, oh my God, that's a beautiful poem. So I thought I'd ask you, as someone who has written so much poetry, and then as poet, as songwriter too, how would you feel about having all of your stanzas broken up into a little deck and to have people play with it and toss it out so that destiny, chance, kismet, whatever you want to call it, arranges it for them in a completely new arrangement? How would you feel about
I have friends who write poems like that, who will write a poem or a page and then rearrange it to get out of that kind of linear line of thought. I think that would be really cool. Yeah, I like that idea a
that?
lot. I've been getting more into tarot and energy work and some things over the last couple of years because I've felt that same kind of connection to something unseen and kind of like this ability to kind of poke through every now and then. It's really interesting. I haven't figured out how that relates to art yet, but it's kind of one of the questions that's circling in my mind.
Me, it completely relates to art. Well, I'll just share. It doesn't have to relate this way for you or anyone else, but I feel really called to tell certain stories that help people touch into certain subtle kind of like inner postures or like inner openings and things. And so I think that's why I'm called to create art, is because I feel called to share kind of these inner openings that I can feel, like to give people something where maybe they can like reach in and touch a piece of it and then be able to find it more themselves or touch that piece and then open in their own way or whatnot. But I mean, I feel like this sense of opening into the invisible world and what's holding us in this collective soup, I feel like is one of the biggest gifts we can give people, to start to trust more in what's unseen and to have an element of conversation or connection with that. That's such a blessing of the boats, like to kiss the wind and turn and know that we're held. And I feel like in this time of, I would say, chaos that's meant to bring us into something so much greater, such chaos probably increasing for people to have an anchor. I feel like you as artists with such a power to create beauty, opening into this space yourself, you can help others reach into something that maybe they haven't yet too. So if you want to, that's it.
Seems like a
No
big,
pressure.
I know that's like a lot of pressure, but I agree though. I think that that is kind of one of the roles of artists. It might have been, was it Lucille Clifton? I forget. It might have been. Maybe it was a different poet who said that the role of art is not to answer questions, but to ask the right questions. And so I think that connects to kind of what you're saying is it helps people to ask those questions themselves. Um, which is interesting because right now I'm writing a lot of stuff about ghosts because I've just been in this space where I've had kind of ghost experiences, and I don't know what's coming through. It's very much feels like right now I have very little control over what I'm writing, and things are just kind of pushing through, which I think just dovetails with the fact that I've started to ask those questions again about these things I feel. They're real in their own way. How do I honor that, and how do I connect with that more? What is the work that you do to get there, which relates to art and that kind of practice, but there's also tools I just don't have yet. But I'm exploring that a little bit.
That sounds so interesting to me. Yeah, there are lots of things that I feel called to share, but it's like you need to share it in a piece where the person experiencing it has to reach into it too, right? Or else like it's not as, that's the only way it can kind of enter them. So it's like offering an opening, but then like they have to meet it and do what they will with it. And that's, I mean, I feel like jumbling someone's poetry up is like an ultimate extreme of just letting it be and letting people have whatever experience they're meant to with it. Hmm. I kind of want to just see what comes out for one now. Let's see what comes. So the two cards that just kind of jumped out from the deck with verses are, and the gulf enters the sea, and so forth, none of them emptying anything. It is your own lush self you hunger for. So,
Mm.
That
hmm.
is that's fantastic. Actually, wow, that's a lot. There's a lot there. That's interesting. That feels like it could be a summary for this moment in my life right now, which is crazy. It also reminds me of a line. I'm going to butcher it now. I've been trying to put this image in this line into poems and songs for like a decade, and it never fits. But it's something like we exist in that space where rivers enter seas, where both their names are lost. That idea of kind of this mixing of things, moment where we enter this kind of brackish state where everything is everything and everything is nothing. It's interesting. That's crazy. How it's the second time that in the last couple of weeks that someone's done a tarot related thing that kind of blew my mind because one of my friends has a deck of tarot animals and they did it for me and they pulled a seahorse. So my whole second book's about the seahorse. So there's been a lot of nice kind of synchronicity with that stuff in my life right now. It's great. Thank you.
Yeah, so much just like this communication. And you said that's something you're always kind of sitting with, communicating and connecting. And now it's just like so large with this unseen space,
Yeah,
perhaps.
I, I don't really
Hmm.
have the vocabulary or the words right now to do that, and so I think that's kind of the process right now. Is how do you reach out? How do you uh, understand? How do you even know when you're being communicated with? Those kind of things. So I'm dipping my toe into that a bit.
Mm.
I feel like maybe podcast number two, you'll have to come back later after you've been grappling in this space. But I'm going to ask before we go, Josh, I'd love for you to read one more poem. And I have one I kind of want you to read.
I'm interested in which one you want me to read, and that's always interesting to me.
Yeah, well, I love a piece of paper on the interstate, and I feel like that's such a beautiful one to share. I have a few that are dog-eared, and here I have cachet, and that's one that's so beautiful when we're thinking about like dropping into these narratives. I mean, I have a few of them, but I think the one that I want to ask you to read, if you don't mind, is Winter Coat, which is on page 72 of the Union of Geometry and Ash.
This was maybe the last poem I wrote in the whole book. I think, and it didn't end up at the end, but yeah, I haven't looked at it in a long time, so I'm excited to kind of experience it again. Um, There's a little quote from the poet Charles Simic at the beginning. It says, "Happiness, you are the bright red lining of the dark winter coat grief wears inside out," which I always, he's a poet I would turn to for the spiritual for sure. All right, let me give it a try. Winter coat. My happiness has three buttons: silver, golden, self destruct. My happiness is fleece lined and out of style, like the coat my mother made me in fifth grade, the coat I slipped free from each morning just before the elementary came into view. A few leaves flagging from the branches, her hands frantically waving from the window. Yes, grief. but sometimes as simple as slipping on a coat and wandering out into the wide world, where the bus stop strangers huddle close as lovers, and the wind tunes every hollow toward a song. Let's hum along. Let's walk arm in arm, so close there's no need for coats, no need to acknowledge the man on the corner who makes a home of his old coat, or to think of the woman right now dying in a country far away. Let someone else lay a coat across her face. This poem is the one where two lovers spread their coats out in a field in winter to make a bed, then a little love, to have a picnic of wax-covered cheese and baguettes and bicker over the names of birds, and meander back through the town admiring the little ghosts their words make, the little ghosts their lives wake, the strangers at every window watching them pass like a day. And there she is, in the window of our house, my mother. It's cold out there, she is saying. Don't forget your coat. I should say also, I try to do this anytime I have an interview or meet anybody interested in poetry. I've noticed the shapes of my poems often they start kind of in a concrete place and they depart and they often return to a concrete place. And if have you ever read the poet Larry Levis? You know Larry Levis?
I don't.
You got to read Larry Levis. He's kind
Okay.
of one of my influences. His last name's spelled like Levi's, and he has really long form poems, and they do this so beautifully. So I always try to get him out. He's a very underappreciated poet, but he's one of those people like Jeff Buckley. When people find him, they tend to become a little obsessed because he is really fantastic.
Thank you. Well, on that, I just want to say, not the poet you just shared, but your poem. I feel like it just holds so much fullness. You know, it's like so many layers and circles and echoes of fullness, like here, there, touching into everything. And I feel like I'm really attuned to the fullness. And I say that when I say fullness, I kind of mean like everything. Like I think you use when you're talking about the sea and the river meeting, you know, and it kind of like, oh shoot, I don't know what words you used. I don't want to say the wrong thing, but it was kind of like you used two words. I'm gonna now because it's reminding me of like for me, I feel the deepest reality is the fullness and the emptiness. And I feel like you kind of used a pair kind of like that. Do you remember what you said?
Um, there's that line kind of idea of like where they meet and both the moons are lost. This idea of they're both separate entities. They're also overlapping, and then together they are nothing. They're unnamed in a way.
Yes. I wonder if you said like nothingness and like everything at the same time. And I feel like that's how I kind of tap into this sense of deepest reality is like the utter fullness and the emptiness. And like when I feel into the fullness, it kind of feels like spontaneous meditative state kind of. I don't like want to get into that too much, but it's like it doesn't feel like regular anything. And I feel like a lot of things hold that fullness, you know, and I feel like this poem holds such sense of that fullness. And so I love it so very much. Um, and thank you.
Thank you. I actually, Cachet was one of the other poems that I had earmarked. And I once heard the poet Lee Young Lee read. Do you know Lee Young Lee?
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah, he's wonderful. Um, he was giving a reading and he said, "Your poems are like your children. You don't have a favorite." And then he said, "But this is my favorite one." Uh, and out of all the poems in the book that I wrote in the first collection, Cachet is probably my favorite one.
Oh, okay, perfect. You must read it.
Like a man rises to greet his life at sunrise, the line of sky lifting into light, and thinks of a woman he had once, how she lifted for him so slowly her skirt, and what came after. Today he'll plummet into love with every woman he meets, with a man raising the gate of his bodega, with eyelids even. Anything that opens, opens him, until later. Until lunch, maybe, when he's walking past the steaming food carts, longing for pierogies from this little Polish diner that went under a few years ago. Potatoes and onions folded into dough, so simple, so impossible to perfect, and he wants suddenly only perfection, to keep walking forever, or to fold himself beneath his bed sheets and imitate oblivion. Like, above him, these lazy doves decorating the trees, each head tucked beneath a wing. Strange to think such a white thing can carry even a spoonful of darkness, but it must.
Beautiful. Thank you. I love so many lines.
It's funny because it kind of takes me back to that parking lot and Jeff Buckley, because that idea of this perfect whiteness and there's always darkness in there, and that's the whiteness is more stark because of the darkness.
There's so much in this conversation, I feel like, where you're touching on this, that everything togetherness, like the light and the dark all held together. And it's just like such a space where I live. So it's just like, I feel it very much. This sense of holding all the things. You have a beautiful gift for that. And I love a lot of lines. In that reading, I was struck by the line, anything that opens, opens him. That's really beautiful. So thank you, Josh Booton.
Thanks for having me.
So it's really nice to meet you, Josh.
It was so lovely. Thanks.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for being with us today. If you feel called, follow the podcast wherever you listen and connect with us on Instagram or YouTube at sacred.conversations.podcast. And most of all, may you keep opening to yourself, to the mystery, and to the story within you that's still being written.